This week in class, we're studying Daniel's chapter 4 and 5. So like chapters 3 and 6, chapters 4 and 5 are parallel chapters. So in other words, they have the same kind of themes happening, the same kind of story structure. And so those of you who've already read those chapters know that we're talking about pride comes before a fall this week, specifically with kings. So in Daniel chapter 4, that was the vision of the cosmic tree. I love that description. We'll talk a little bit later in our lesson, but that was actually a Babylonian myth, was this cosmic tree, Assyrian too. So very Mesopotamian things happening in the book of Daniel. And so we'll talk about what that means and how that dream has impacted Daniel. And then we've got Daniel chapter 5, which is my favorite out of all of the books of Daniel. This is my favorite. It's the handwriting on the wall, which cracks me up because that has really come into our popular culture, right? The writing on the wall. Mm-hmm. People say that all the time. It's a common idiom. So we'll talk about that, chapter 5, and I have some crazy, interesting connections with that one I'm excited to share. But first, we have an icebreaker. What I want to do is think about Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. And I'll read that to you here quickly. That says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." So think about, you reap what you sow. And think of it in context of recent news that you've read, or maybe people that you know about. I want you to, I'm going to put you in a breakout room here in a minute. I'll give you maybe 8 minutes or so. Talk about, what have you seen in the news? What have you heard about people around you? People who reaped what they sowed. It could be good, it could be bad. See if you can find that, a recent example of that verse. And let me get the breakout room going. You went in your breakout rooms to talk about current examples, news articles, or people that you know who have reaped what they sowed from Galatians 6:7. All right, so scribes, jump in. Tell me what your group talked about. Don't everybody go at once.
Meredith, go.
Oh, am I the scribe? Oh,
yeah,
here, I can write it down. So none of us watched the news. So we didn't have any of current events to share. I shared personally that we just got a new dog, so we're really reaping what we sow. When I find shoes in weird places and things like that. And then another example was of a volleyball tournament with a team feeling like they could never beat this other team that's always like number one, and they were number 2 anyway, but they were super determined, and that determination actually got them the win this time. And then the last one was choosing a husband that can cook, because then you haven't cooked 99% of your meals. Kimberly, that's I think awesome. you know who I'm talking about. So yes, that actually was a really good one. That was a very positive reaping what you sow, for sure.
That is, I like the positivity.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the food is amazing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring you down a little bit here. So we shared that some robbers had well, actually it worked out well, but some robbers had been vandalizing grocery stores and stealing, and when they actually, one of them left their wallets behind with their driver's license and ultimately got caught. So kind of reap what you sow there. Then we talked about some current events, Amy Coney Barrett obviously being one of those, living a life above reproach to sit on the highest seat in the in the Justice Department, or Justice as Chief Justice. We talked about children, training our children, and godly, being godly examples to them, and then them not departing from the faith. We had someone do some work that then received for free, and then received some unexpected money that was really needed for a good cause. And we had obviously some missionary things, obviously all the missionaries and what they reap, and how God is the one who sows that, or we sow it and he reaps that, and the kingdom grows. So we had a lot of others, but I'll let others talk.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good examples. Okay, who's next? Oh, Cammie, is that you? Are you muted?
Okay, here I am.
There you go.
Barbara and I were alone in our breakout group, and I had a story that I was walking with a friend yesterday, and she takes care of her mother-in-law. She and her husband live in their basement, and the mother-in-law gets very, very hateful. And if my friend tries to change anything, she gets really angry and makes her change it back. So this happened, and my friend and her husband actually sat down and talked with the mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law, then gets to saying, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to turn out that way. And, you didn't have to change that back. And so my friend actually said the words, well, Wanda, you reap what you sow. So.
Ooh, good deal. That's an unfortunate situation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you and Barbara have any other recent articles? Any other examples you want to share? Okay. So I know it's when you watch the news, you often see the negative side of this. Kim, I liked your robber story, or whoever had that in your group. That is so true. Yeah. That's typically what we think of when you hear you reap what you sow. And that's very true with Daniel's chapter 4 and 5 as well. We totally see that with King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. And then we see that in Daniel chapter 5 with Belshazzar, especially with him. The next thought I wanted to go to, after thinking about what's in the media, or examples have of other people.
Samantha,
I want to change. Yeah.
Samantha, we didn't really get to tell you ours. I was thinking somebody else would hop in there.
I'm so sorry.
But
Please
one
do.
of them I thought was good was we were talking about North Side moving outside, moving from inside to outside. And when we did, we got more people outside. But when we moved back inside, the crowds were bigger than before that we had inside. So that we felt like we reaped after, I don't know how we'd sowed, but anyway, we encouraged people to come, and more people came. And then Hunter Biden's videotapes, or whatever's on those are coming to light. Evidently some of his, I don't know, bad examples are going to be shown in the light now. So he's going to reap what he sowed. One of the things I showed was my tomatoes that I planted last, May, I think, and they're all now coming to fruition, hopefully before it frosts.
All right.
And then, how that show, The Nanny, shows how disciplining children brings about almost immediate results if you do it right. So evidently, a lot of people need to tweak what they do, because you definitely want to reap good things from your discipline. Anyway, I think that summed it up pretty good. If I missed something, Peggy, or anyway, oops. I'm through.
Nope, that's all right. Pat, thank you so much. No,
Okay,
Pat, thank you for jumping in. Sorry,
you're
I
welcome.
talked right over you.
You're welcome.
So very good examples of what's happening in our world about that. You can find all kinds of examples of politics on both sides, not just American politics too, even foreign politics. So yeah, there's a lot of people to learn lessons from, so to speak. So let's think about not just other people in relation to Galatians 6:7, but what about ourselves? Have there been times where you have reaped what you've sown personally? I have an example that I can share from me, and I mean it's kind of a silly example, but with my RA, anytime I do certain activities, like if I eat too much sugar, the next day I hurt, my joints hurt, and it's kind of a trivial example, but I know if I do this thing, I'm going to reap pain. I don't always follow that. Sometimes I take calculated risks and I just eat the chocolate bar anyway. But think about personally for you. I'll give you a second. Well, I'll give you about 40 seconds or so. Think about an example in your life that you personally have reaped what you've sown. So I'll set my 40-second timer here. Okay. Oops, I didn't mean to, but I hit the mute all. Sorry about that. I gave you permissions back. You can unmute yourselves. Sorry about that. Let's have you guys unmute yourselves and jump in and tell me what are some examples in your own personal life about a time where you reaped what you sowed. Anybody can jump in. I'm not gonna call names. If you have a good example, jump in anytime.
Sam, not that this is any better than anyone else, but 12 years post college or med school is just, to me, has been really a joy because I enjoy what I do, and just that was a lot of sewing. A lot of time sewing.
Absolutely.
And I do feel that there are a lot of benefits that I get to enjoy with my schedule, and I love what I do. So
that's a great example. You worked very hard for that. Mm-hmm.
Not that other people don't, but yes, that just comes to mind.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Sam, I'm going to say kind of along the same lines as Kim. I did not, I was married before I left high school, and so I didn't go to college until John and I were married, and Lena and Belinda were, had actually graduated from high school and were, Lena was in college. So, but then to go through that and finish that in 4 years, and to be able to have a job kind of like Kim did, the job that I retired from, I loved my job. It really brought me a lot of joy. There was a lot of sacrifice during the time that I was going to college. My husband would tell you that he didn't think he had a wife for 2 years. And so, but to be able to see that first of all, the time I was able to spend raising our daughters so that they could become productive women, good Christian women, raising Christian children. That was a benefit. And then also having a job that would provide for us so that now we can, as Kim was saying too, we have the benefit in our retirement of having those things that we would not have had without that education. So it's just, we as a family have just been blessed very generously. So that's
Thank you,
kind
Brenda.
of reaping what
That
sowed.
sounds, yeah, that's a lot of sacrifice that has really paid off. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. Do we have one or two more who want to share?
I'd like to add in a real positive one, but I'm not sure this is very positive all the time. You can tell I've been spending my time with a lot of children, and sometimes even raising my own daughters and now watching my grandchildren with their parents, what comes out of their mouths, you're just kind of like, whoa, that kind of sounded like me. And, you just really have to watch in their formative years how much you shape them. And, you're kind of sowing bits of yourself into them and how they respond to things kind of. And I just got off the phone with my youngest daughter, who is just handling a situation that is difficult and challenging in a very awesome way. And I'm trying to emulate her attitude in this because we have some business dealings going on. And I told her, I think I'm learning from her. So what she's sowing, I'm reaping. So
Very nice. It's a two-way street for sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. I catch myself sounding like my mother every day.
that, and I look in the mirror.
Oh.
And I see my mom.
Yeah, me too.
It's not always a bad thing.
Right?
Yep. Okay. One last call. Last call if you want to share an example. No pressure.
One of the things I decided to do is to try to help pregnant mothers to keep their babies. So I've been not only taking a check now and then up to a pregnancy center, but also leaving some of the Bibles that I bought from World Bible. And they sent me a letter saying, I mean, it wasn't just to me, I'm sure it was a form letter, but one of the things they mentioned was that because of the ultrasounds, the specific person had decided to keep the baby. And so I feel like that's reaping in a way, even though it's not for me personally, I'm feeling like I'm having an effect with other people doing things that way.
That's fantastic. You're making yourself available to help. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Pat. Okay, so how do we approach Daniel's chapter 4 and 5, thinking about you reap what you sow? Now, in this case, it was definitely more negative than it was positive, because we'll see in chapter 5, an entire empire was replaced overnight because of what was sown previously. So, but first, let's tackle chapter 4. And I wanted to actually, Brenda Heller sent me a great timeline that I'm going to email out after. And I have another timeline that I'll share with you. Let me see if I can share my screen and find it. I don't know if I can find it. Nope, I don't have it up yet. I will email it out. But what it does is it places all of the chapters in context so you can see in chronological order what king ruled when. Because as you noticed last week when we did chapters 3 and 6, that was 2 different time periods in the same book of Daniel. And even tonight is 2 different time periods and 2 different empires. So that timeline, I hope, will help you visually see where things fall in what order. So I'll get that in the email to you afterwards. But I do have some other pictures that I'll share as we go along tonight. So first, let's talk about King Nebuchadnezzar. And in chapter 4, he has this dream of the cosmic tree. That title kind of cracks me up. It gives certain mental images when you hear cosmic. But it is a message from the gods, from his perspective. And the tree motif, the tree image, was very common in Assyrian and even Babylonian mythology. So that meant something to them. So now here to have a tree dream and then have a Jewish exile interpret that is pretty amazing that we get to read about it. And so we start off, I know that you've already read the chapter, so I'm not going to reread. What I'll do is I'll go through different verses and I will highlight different interesting things. I'm going to check my time here to make sure I get you guys out on time. So if you think about the image of a tree, because you already know the rest of the Bible story, when you read Daniel chapter 4, you might have thought of the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. That the tree of life, that, well, the whole Genesis chapters 1 through 3 is actually repeated throughout the Hebrew Bible. In multiple stories, you can see echoes of it. And this is one of those. So the tree here should make you think back to the tree of life. But what we're seeing here is there's a choice set before King Nebuchadnezzar. He can choose, like Adam and Eve, he can choose to take the fruit. And, you know, in other words, have pride in himself, which we see is the choice he makes. But he was given the opportunity to change. He was given 1 whole year to change his ways. He could have had maybe not necessarily the Garden of Eden, but a Garden of Eden-like kingdom where God ruled through him. That could have been possible. But as we see, he got pretty prideful in his own settings. He was pretty comfortable in his nice palace. And we know what happened with that. What's really interesting is that if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 31, you'll read about a prophecy about Babylon. And no, wait, that's not true. Ezekiel 31 is about Pharaoh and how Pharaoh was like a cedar of Lebanon tree that was felled or cut down. And so Ezekiel 31 is fascinating to me. Ezekiel, remember, lived at the same time as Daniel. I'm not getting these mixed up, am I? Let me come back here with you and look at Ezekiel. So Ezekiel chapter 31, and I'll put this in the email that goes out as well. Yeah, Ezekiel 31, Pharaoh as a felled cedar of Lebanon. And if you read through it, there are a lot of similarities between this and Daniel chapter 4. Fascinating. There's nothing new under the sun. I love how the biblical writers repeat certain motifs and certain patterns. They're trying to tell us something. And so we see this, and so we know Nebuchadnezzar has this choice. Now, what's interesting is in chapter 4, verse 13, we see what's called the Watcher. Now, your translation might call it an angel, and that translation didn't come until like later New Testament times. But a Watcher was kind of a specific heavenly being that now we call an angel. In our modern culture, when we think of the term Watcher, we think of maybe horror movies. Does anybody know about, you know what I'm talking about? There are some scary or creepy connotations with the word watchers, but that's what they do. They are messengers or heavenly beings who God uses to send messages or to do these kinds of activities like we see here in chapter 4, because that's the one that declares the tree should be cut down. When we get to, let me get here on mine as well. So when we get to verse 30, Daniel 4 verse 30, let me get there. This is where the dream is fulfilled. So King Nebuchadnezzar, 12 months later, on his roof, on the palace, he said, "Is this not the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Side note is that he actually was a really amazing builder and organized lots of different buildings. I'll show you a couple here before we run out of time. And again, I'll share these later as well. This is an artist rendering of ancient Babylon. And so this big gate right here, the small portion of that gate is actually in Berlin, in Germany, at the Pergamon Museum. And so this is part of his building and construction works. Huge avenues when you walk down, and that's actually still there today. You can still walk down this processional way in Babylon, Iraq. So still there. Huge, prolific builder that is legendary. Again, you can still go see the ruins of his stuff today. You might have heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That actually turns out it wasn't hanging, and it wasn't from Babylon. It was now we scholars have discovered it's actually from Nineveh, which was ancient Assyria, or think Jonah, and it was from a different king. But that scale of building is what Nebuchadnezzar was known for. He's the one that turned Babylon from a backwater town into a huge bustling metropolis that had 500,000 people. So it was a big place. So I've heard Max Lucado say he was royalty mixed with an oil baron, mixed with a billionaire hedge fund manager. I mean, like, he had it all. And so, we can see he had that attitude of, I did this. And I love how it says, while those words were on his lips, that's when his fate was decided. And it turns out that in verse 33, you can think about Nebuchadnezzar, turning into an animal and grazing on the grass. He is in exile from humanity. So we've talked about in exile that he exacted on a different culture, Daniel's, but now Nebuchadnezzar is in his own exile. Okay. Those are the main points I wanted to talk about chapter 4 that I found interesting. Did anything stick out to you that you found interesting? Do you think what he received just?
I thought it was interesting in verse 4, in 4:17, it says, "The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men."
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So both of these chapters are showing this very thing. So Pat, you've hit on the main theme, not just for these chapters, but for the whole book of Daniel. Do you guys remember that poll from the very first class? What is the main theme of Daniel? Now you all know, right? It's what? Please tell me you know.
Sovereignty of God.
Yes. The sovereignty of God. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. If there's nothing else from chapter 4, let's swing over to chapter 5 in our last few minutes here. Okay, chapter 5. is one of my favorites. And what you should know is that you can go back to the book of Isaiah in chapters 13 and 14, and it predicts what's about to happen here in chapter 5. So you can write that down, go read it on your own. Isaiah chapters 13 and 14. Again, I'll put that in the email. Fascinating, fascinating. So the judgment against Babylon is being talked about by multiple prophets, not just Daniel, not just Ezekiel too. Okay, so chapter 5 begins at a fabulous party, but not just any party. We're now 42 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. So we're fast forwarding in time. And Belshazzar is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, but not his direct son. Belshazzar's father is named Nabonidus, and he was away. He was away on business when this event happened. He was actually over in Arabia on the map. He was nowhere near Babylon during the events of this chapter. And so they were co-regents. So Belshazzar was watching the kingdom while his dad was away. Okay. And so what happens when parents are away? Sometimes. Okay, so the year is 539 BC, but we're about to find out the date and the month in just a minute. I think you'll find this really fascinating too. Okay, right before this chapter begins, you need to know that a king named Cyrus from a little kingdom called Media, now we call it Persia, they were kind of merged. He was on the move with his army, and he was moving westward, conquering different towns and areas on his way to Babylon. So when we start chapter 5, they're not just there partying while dad's gone, although they are, but really what they're doing, they know that Cyrus is on the way. But they are so overconfident in Babylon and its army and its structures that will protect them around the city. They don't even worry about it. They just go and have their feast. But so anyway, they're not worried. But probably in the next few days, Cyrus would reach Babylon in their mind. You know, they've got some time. And what they're doing, if you look at verse 4, they are toasting to the gods. And, you know, maybe they gave a drink offering, a libation. But what they're doing really is celebrating their past, they celebrate their past victories ahead of what they know is going to be a battle with Cyrus, King Cyrus. And so what are they drinking out of? Did that catch your attention? Ooh, it goes back to chapter 1. The gold and silver goblets from God's temple, the ones that were dedicated to God and that were sacred. And we'll come back to that sacredness of it in a little bit. But they're using it as they worship their gods and as they toast to their gods. What they're doing is using those gold and silver goblets. They're using it to recall the defeat of Yahweh, of the God of heaven. And so it's that kind of part of their culture is really interesting. So they do this, the night before they think they're headed into battle. They're wanting their gods to protect them and give them victory in the next battle, which they think will be with King Cyrus. So they're doing this. And then what happens in verse 5? We see the hand. Man, I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall. Don't you? So they're terrified. And the main reason is because when they had battles back then, what they would do to count, they would count casualties. So how many people did they kill in battle? They would literally go from dead body to dead body and cut off their right hands. And that's how they kept count of the casualties. So they could say, we defeated so many people because look, here's all their right hands. Isn't that gross? I mean, to us, it's super gross. But the hands that they cut off of the dead, lifeless bodies, the hands would have been dead and lifeless too. But we see the opposite of that happening in this story. It is a very much alive hand delivering a message on the wall. In fact, I have that painting. Let me share that with you. This is my favorite Bible painting ever. It's a Rembrandt. What cracks me up is he painted it in like the 14th or 15th century Dutch style. So this is not the clothes that Belshazzar would have worn. This is what they wore in the Netherlands for kings and queens back in Rembrandt's time. It also cracks me up that Hebrew writing on the wall. It's gibberish. I just love it. I love it. And kind of on purpose too, because they didn't know what it meant on the wall at first. So anyway, it's appropriate in the painting, I think, that it's gibberish. So they panic. They don't know what to do. This animated hand, detached from anything, is writing this coded message on the wall. They might have kind of had an idea of what was written on the wall, but maybe they didn't understand the meaning. Scholars have different opinions on that. But what we see is that the Queen Mother is there. This would have been Belshazzar's mother, the wife of Nabonidus. And so she's like, hey, there's this guy who served Nebuchadnezzar. And I just love how Daniel's reputation precedes him. That's a really interesting description there in verse 11 of his reputation. And he would have been in his, maybe approaching his 80s at this point. We know he lived to be at least 85 or so. So he's up there in years and he's not having it. He was very blunt in verse 17. Normally you would have courtesies when you talk to the king, but not Daniel. He's like, man, if you'd paid attention, you'd have known this. So Daniel reminds him the history. Belshazzar would have known the story about Nebuchadnezzar becoming like an animal to be humbled by the God of heaven. It's like he would have known that story. That was not even 50 years before his time. And so Daniel reminds him of that and then translates the message. And so when we read that message, what it's really saying, and I don't exactly know how to pronounce it in Aramaic. I don't speak Aramaic. I need to find an Aramaic speaker and see if I can find this. Listen to it for what it would have really sounded like. But what it meant was it was a set of weights. So there was a weight called a mina, M-I-N-A, a mina. And so that's the first part of the message. It looks like mine. So that would have been a number, a specific weight. They would have had a set of scales, right? And the next one, tekel, would have been like a shekel. And so they would have weighed the shekel. And then the next one, the parsa would have been half a shekel, I think, if I remember that right. And so what the message is really saying is God is measuring you. And so it means numbered, weighted, and divided about Belshazzar's actions and behaviors. God has measured him according to his standards and has found him wanting. And so what's really amazing about that is that in 539 BC, the month was October, and the Babylonians were amazing astrologers who connected the stars. They saw Libra in the mid-October night sky. And Libra is the scales, right?
Is the what?
The scales.
Mhm.
Like
Oh,
the judge with
gotcha.
the scales.
Or balance.
Yes, the balance. I'm a Libra. My birthday's on Thursday, guys.
Woo! Happy birthday.
But anyway, so the night that this happened, actually would have been like the 12th or 13th of our October. On the Babylonian calendar, it happened on the 16th, which had a special significance. Their astrologers would have known about all of that, and they would have looked at Daniel's interpretation and then looked at the night sky with the scales with Libra, and they would have said, yes, we confirm that. That must be what this means. It would have made sense to them. And so, they go to bed that night. I'm not sure what Belshazzar was thinking, but he wasn't thinking it long, because that night is when King Cyrus did a surprise attack on the city. They literally walked right in and took the city. There was no fighting. They just gave up. And so that is what's talked about back in Isaiah chapter 13 and 14, how the Medes would come in and take the Babylonians. They would defeat the Babylonians. And that literally happens here in chapter 5. You see it happen in real time. I mean, biblically speaking. And so if you go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue, remember the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar. What came next? Right? The chest of silver, the chest and arms of silver are the Medes and the Persians. It's kind of they merged, but it's the same group of people. So now Nebuchadnezzar, dead and gone, the Babylonian Empire has now transferred to King Cyrus and the Persians. We'll just say Persians just to make it simple, but the Medes and Persians. And so now we're on the next part of the statue. So even in Daniel's lifetime, he saw this happening and God's word being fulfilled with the dream statue. Okay. The last thought I want to leave you with, I know I'm running you over time tonight. Okay. The last thought I want to leave you with is think about those gold and silver goblets from the temple. So they had just been sitting in the temple of Marduk there in Babylon that whole time until Belshazzar decides to go and get them, dig them back out and use them to toast to his gods, right? The god of wood and the god of iron and all of that. So those sacred objects were used they were in the temple. They were dedicated to God. And I want you to think about how, as Christians, we're told that, our bodies are the temple, right? And that when we become Christians, we are dedicated to God. And we are holy to God. We are set apart for God's service. So think about yourself as a vessel of God. And think about, how do we use our bodies? How do we use our minds? How do we use our talents for God and for furthering his kingdom, that big rock from chapter 2. So I think there's some lessons we can take from this. Even though it wasn't written to us, we can still use the lessons learned from that chapter. So think about yourself like a holy vessel that belongs to God. So how are you using your life to further his kingdom? So think about this week as you go through the week, and we'll come back next week and we'll talk about chapter 7. So big picture here, chapters 1 through 6 are all about Daniel and his friends and their adventures or misadventures maybe. And all of that builds up to chapter 7. So in other words, we can't tackle chapter 7 without really understanding chapters 1 through 6 and how the stories really establish God's sovereignty. And so now that we're done with chapters 1 through 6, next week we'll tackle chapter 7, because that is the key to the whole book of Daniel, and later on to the revelation of the Apostle John. And we'll open that up and take a look at something called the Son of Man. Jesus used that a lot. Jesus understood himself through Daniel chapter 7. So I'll give you homework, which is just to read chapter 7, and I'll have a video for you to watch as well from the Bible Project. And then if you like podcasts that do a deep dive, I have one of those too as well. So any questions about chapters 4 and 5 from today? Anything stand out to you? Anything surprise you? Tough crowd. Okay. I'll think about being a Libra a little differently now, knowing that all these years ago in 539 BC is when this happened. I have one of those star apps on my phone and the iPad, and you can hold it up and look at the stars and stuff. I'm gonna go find that in the night sky now. Not that
Hey, have fun.
Thank you.
Okay, so that covers chapters 4 and 5, and we are done.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for bearing
Thank
with
you.
our
Thank you.
technical issues.
Thanks so much.
Happy birthday, Thursday.
Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Thank you, Sam. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye.
Bye-bye.